Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Harwood Half Hour. Today's episode, MLK and Our Walls. We all know that Martin Luther King's birthday was yesterday, though many of us will be celebrating it on this coming Monday. And as I said, today's topic is MLK and Our Walls. Before I begin, Happy New Year. I hope your new year is off to a great start. And as you're listening today, shoot me a message about where you're listening from and give me a thumbs up that you can hear me. And also a question for you to think about as I'm going through our Facebook Live today is this: how do we take down the walls that exist between and among us in our country? How do we take down the walls that exist between and among us in our country? As we approach the official celebration of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, I'm reminded of a speech he gave in Berlin in September of 1964. It was actually a speech while the Berlin Wall still existed, as you know, because it didn't come down till much later. And this sermon, not a speech, but a sermon, was actually given on the East Berlin side of the wall. And in this sermon, King said that we need to break down the dividing walls of hostility between us. We need to break down the dividing walls of hostility between us. And if you read his sermon, he's really talking about two different kinds of walls, both of which I want to talk about today. One is the physical wall, in this case, the Berlin Wall that he was referring to. But most of his sermon actually didn't deal with that. It dealt with the walls in our minds, the walls in our minds that we build in terms of others in our lives, others in our communities, others in our country, and for him, other people in our world, and for us, other people in our world. And that these walls are walls that we create, they're walls that we build, they're walls that we keep making higher and higher, so that we don't actually have to see others, be with others. And so today, what I want to talk about is I don't want to get, let me just be really clear about this. I don't want to get into a debate about the wall on our southern border with Mexico. I just want to be really clear about this and certain about this. I want to be really clear, as I've written about before, that I don't want to demonize people on either side of this debate. I don't want to dismiss people's concerns on either side of this debate. I think there are legitimate concerns that people hold on all sides of this debate. And let me also be really clear that, because some people wonder about this when I've written about it, I actually do believe that countries, nations, have the right to protect their borders and secure their borders. And there is often a need to protect and secure our borders. I see that, I believe it, I recognize it. And so I've written about this recently. You can go to my blog and see a piece I wrote called Tear Down This Wall, referring to when Ronald Reagan stood in front of the Berlin Wall, just like Martin Luther King Jr. did back in September of '64. I'm releasing a piece this Friday called MLK and Our Walls, the topic of this Facebook Live and topic of the piece that will be coming out on Friday. And tomorrow night, I'll be on the Jim Bohannon Show at 11 p.m. Eastern Time, which is a radio program heard all across the country. So you can find it in your local listings, the Jim Bohannon Show, or text or Google it, and you can find how you can listen to it. But it is on the debate over the walls and what it means for our society. So today, as I said, I don't want to focus on the wall on our southern border, but what I do want to focus on are the walls that we build between and among us. And I happen to believe that increasingly the debate about the wall on our senior border is affecting how we see one another in our ordinary lives, that the debate about the wall on our southern border has been corrosive to our body politic. I believe that it has hardened our hearts because the ways in which we talk about that wall does in fact demonize many people. It often does dismiss different arguments, and it makes us believe, I think, implicitly makes us believe at times, that if we simply build a wall, whether it's a physical wall or a mental wall in our minds, that somehow or another we can separate ourselves from others. And I I even think that this debate in our country about the wall on our southern border sometimes leads us to believe, or at least suggests, that if we only build a wall, we can solve all our social ills. You know, we can solve the drug problem, we can solve the crime problem, we can solve the immigration problem. It's like a panacea for all these social ills that we wrestle with. And you and I know, and so many people know, that to really, truly, genuinely address those concerns, it's going to take much more than a wall. And building a wall, no matter how high it is, no matter how big the door is in it, no matter anything about it. Our problems extend far beyond a wall, which is not to say that a wall couldn't help us, but that it's not a panacea, whether it's a physical wall or a wall in our minds. There is no panacea for our challenges. And the argument I want to make today is that our belief in walls, particularly imaginary walls that we build between and among us, is separating us in our society and having really bad effects on our society. And that so long as we have walls around our identity, walls around our grievances, walls around the part of the country in which we live, walls about which political party we belong to and the political party we don't belong to, that all of these things, identity, grievances, geography, political parties, the sports teams we root for, all of these things, when we're not careful, erect walls in our lives, separate us from one another in our lives, sometimes demonize the other in our lives, create a sense of the other in our lives. And here's the thing. We cannot create a society based on our shared lives. We cannot create a more hopeful society if we are separated by walls, particularly the walls in our minds as we think about other people and ourselves in our society. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to offer 3 things that I'm hoping you can think about in terms of the walls that we have created in our society. And these are initial thoughts for me. These are things I've been thinking about, writing about. I just got back from Israel where these things came up a lot. And so think of these 3 things as a down payment for me about how you might think about how we take down the walls in our communities and society. I happen to believe that fundamentally each of us needs to be in the business not of erecting walls in our lives, but of creating and building new pathways to one another so that we can create our shared lives and a society in which we are more hopeful about the possibilities of what we can create together, right? So 3 things. The first one is this. How is it that you can think about what it means to recommit ourselves to seeing and hearing people? And when I say people, I mean all people, not just some people. You know, my daughter, for the holidays, gave me a new book called Heartland, which I'm in the middle of. I confess I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I'm in the middle of it. And it's written by an author named Sarah Smart. She's incredibly smart and capable and writes beautifully. And she grew up in Kansas in a rural town. And in this book, Sarah Smart writes about what it's like growing up in Kansas and feeling invisible to the rest of the country. That when people refer to where she lived, where she grew up, and where she still lives, they refer to it as flyover country. I'm sure you may have heard that before, flyover country. That people make all sorts of assumptions about what matters to folks in Kansas. In fact, that she believes that they know very little about her life and the lives of others in her family and in the communities in which she grew up. She talks a lot about what it means to feel neither seen nor heard, to feel invisible. And so what does it mean for us, for all of us, to feel seen and heard? So many of us in our society today, whether you live in a rural town in Kansas or you live in a certain part of Detroit, or you live in Mississippi where we're doing work in the Delta of Mississippi, or you live in Paradise that just experienced the forest fires in California where we have a partner library there, or you live in some other part of our country, wherever it may be. So many people that I engage in our work tell me that they don't feel seen and heard. They feel invisible. What matters to them, they say, doesn't matter to the rest of us. So in your own life, I'm not asking you to take on the country. I'm not asking you to take on the world and be a global citizen right now. I'm really asking you in your own daily life. I want to make this really practical, really actionable, really doable. So in your own daily life, what would it mean for you to see and hear other people, all people? What would it mean in your workplace to see and hear all people, not just your colleagues, but people you pass in the hallway? People are maybe doing a totally different job than yours, maybe the person who cleans your office at night. What would it mean for you to see and hear people on your way to work? What would it mean for you to see and hear people when you're watching the news, people who seem so far away and distant from you, who seem to have different concerns from you, who may be invisible in your daily life? What would it mean in those settings as you're watching TV, listening to the radio, walking to work, driving to work, in your workplace, in your place of worship, to see and hear all people, particularly those people you consider to be different from yourself, who look different from you, who maybe sound different from you, maybe who have a different faith from you, maybe live on a different side of town from you, maybe make a different amount of money from you, maybe who drive a different type of car from you. What would it mean for you to see and hear them? So that's number one. I want you to think about that. And I want you to think about what it would mean for you to open yourself up to see and hear other people, so that maybe we can begin to act on what matters to people in their lives. The second thing is this. What would it mean for you to think about what it takes for us to honor one another's identities, and also for us to challenge ourselves to step beyond them to create a greater whole? I have been thinking in our country, in Canada, I just got off the phone with a CEO of an organization in Canada, or in Israel, where as I just mentioned, I just came back from a few weeks ago. In all of these places, in all of our lives, it seems to me that our society is balkanizing, is becoming balkanized by identities, by our identities. There are so many of us who now identify more with our identities than with some larger identity. Now, this has always been the case since humans have been around. We've always identified with our tribes, with our clan, with our family, with our group, with our faith, whatever it may be. But I happen to believe in America right now, in Canada right now, in Israel right now, in Australia right now, all places where we do work, in Kenya, in other places, that our identities have taken on even more importance, because the more pressure we're under, the more we don't feel seen and heard, the more we believe that we have been wronged in some way, we associate more and more with our identities, the more our society breaks apart and fragments. And so I happen to believe that our identities, our individual identities, our separate identities, is something to recognize, it's something to honor. I happen to believe it's something we should celebrate. I believe it is part of the strength of our country, that we come from and that we have and hold different identities. I think it is part of who we are, it's part of who we have always been. I also believe that if we remain fragmented and build walls between and among our identities, and we simply fight things out from the perspective of our identities, then it is nearly impossible, if not impossible, to create shared lives. That it is impossible, if not nearly impossible, to make community a common enterprise. And I happen to believe community needs to be a common enterprise because we need each other in order to create the kinds of communities that we all want to live in. We need each other to come together and solve our common challenges like education, the opioid crisis, prejudice and racism. We need each other. We can't solve these problems if we have walls built around us. We can't do it. I often think about this. Here's a simple example, and I hope it helps. I often think about this in terms of sports. You know, I'm a huge sports fan. I love sports. And I often think about this, for instance, you know, I live in Washington, D.C. now, and I root for the Washington Capitals, the hockey team here. We won, by the way, the Stanley Cup last year, just in case there are any hockey fans out there, particularly those from Canada. I want you to know we won it. But here's the thing. I hate the Philadelphia Flyers. I can't stand their uniforms. I don't like their players. I don't like their coach. I particularly don't like their fans. And everyone I know from Philadelphia knows that I feel this way about them. So in that sense, I have this strong identity for the Washington Capitals. I have a strong wall built against the Philadelphia Flyers. I don't want to come together with them. I don't want to do anything with them. Sometimes I hate them. But here's the thing. When America is in the Olympics, there are players from the Capitals and the Flyers, the Philadelphia Flyers, on our Olympic team. And on that Olympic team, they are wearing the uniform of the United States of America. They're not wearing the uniform of the Washington Capitals. They're not wearing the uniform of the Philadelphia Flyers. They're not wearing the uniform of any other NHL hockey team in the States. At that moment, I am able to tear down the walls between a Washington Capitals fan and a Philadelphia Flyers fan and transcend those identities to root for something larger called our country in the Olympics. And so here's the thing. And I do that without giving up my identity as a Washington Capital fan, but also going beyond it to root for the greater whole. And so in our lives, how is it that we can maintain our identities? So many of us have multiple identities. How we can maintain our identities, but also move beyond them to help create a greater whole, which means that we have to aspire to things that transcend our identities, that include and transcend our identities, that enable us to create shared lives and, I would argue, maintain our individual identities at the same time. That's something for you to think about. Here's a third point for you to think about in terms of how we get in the business of tearing down walls in our minds about one another and creating new pathways to find each other to create shared lives. I think I need you to think about how you can think about what does it take for us to acknowledge people's grievances in our society and to come together and take action on them. Here's the thing. I think so many of us have grievances about what's happening in our country, what's happening to us, what's happening to people like us. Here's a quick story. I was in a meeting a week or two ago, and there was a researcher there who had gone out and talked to predominantly white Trump voters in predominantly rural areas in the US. And he was reporting back on his findings, and he was saying that these Trump voters feel as though they have many grievances. They feel left behind. They feel as though they've been wronged. They're concerned that no one listens to them. They're concerned about issues around the criminal justice system being rigged against them. They have grievances about the opioid crisis and how that's come to be. They have grievances about the breakdown of the family and the role that government institutions have played in that. And as this person was reporting out on their research, it was really interesting to watch the 50 or 60 people in the room respond. I thought they might say, geez, you know, that's really interesting. It's important to know. But here's some of the comments I heard. They said, you know, what are they complaining about? They don't have it so bad. Another few people said, you know, I didn't know rural people were concerned about those issues. I only thought they were concerned about guns and things like that. Another person said, I don't know what they have to complain about. I've had it a lot worse over my life and going back generations. These people, if they were wronged at all, which I don't think they were wrong just in the last 10, 15, 20 years. What do they have to complain about? And on and on and on and on this went. And as I sat there, I was actually thinking about this Facebook Live and what I might say. And I thought about conveying this story to you, because this to me is part of the problem with the walls that we have in our society right now. We're in a competition about whose grievances are worse. We're in a competition about who can get their grievances on the public agenda ahead of someone else's. We just want to yell louder and louder about our grievances and overwhelm everyone else, and so that our grievances count. And here's what I have come to know in this work. One is that our grievances, so many people in society today have grievances. African Americans have grievances going back generations to the founding of this country. Native Americans have grievances in terms of what has happened to their tribes, to their nations. Trump voters, which I don't actually believe is a monolithic group, but there are some people who live in rural areas who have grievances about what's happened, as for instance in West Virginia and parts of Kentucky, where the coal industry has been decimated and people have been left without jobs, and they've been made promises and promises over and over again by government agencies and politicians and nonprofits and other groups, and those promises haven't been fulfilled. So many of us have grievances today. And so I think the question for us as we think about what does it mean to acknowledge the grievances in our society and to also find ways to move beyond them, to step beyond them, so that we can create a greater whole together. What does it mean for us to actually hear people's grievances? I think there's a lot of pain and sorrow and a sense of loss in our society when it comes to these grievances. And will we have the courage to step into this space and to actually listen to one another? And in listening, not think about how we can outdo someone else, but actually refrain from that and take the time and open ourselves up and open our hearts up to actually hear someone else's grievances, as painful as they may be. And I can tell you, in a lot of the communities that I've worked in, the grievances that people have are painful to hear. They're often directed at other people. They're directed at past injustices which implicate other people, which implicate our country, our society. And it's painful to hear. It's painful to be in the space. But are we willing to do it? Because I think in order to move forward, to tear down these walls, we're going to have to be willing to experience some of that pain, to endure some of it, to hear these different grievances, to recognize that we are not the only ones who hold grievances. And I think then we're going to have to find ways to genuinely address these things. Not all of them, not all at once, but that we can start to make some down payments on what it means to move forward together. You know, there's an old country song, the refrain of which is, "I can't see me in your eyes anymore." And I think people build walls because they don't believe anyone can see them. They don't believe that they're heard, that they're seen, that what matters to them matters to us all. And I think if in fact we want to create shared lives, if in fact we want to make community a common enterprise, if in fact we want to come together to solve problems like inadequate public schools or the opioid crisis or crime or whatever it may be, or our own personal safety, then we're going to have to tear down these walls that exist between and among us. And we're going to have to create new pathways to find one another and make a go of it together. In that sermon, I was mentioning that Martin Luther King Jr. gave in September of '64. There's another line I want to read to you that he said that really struck me as I was going through it this week in preparation for today. He said this, and I'll read it because I didn't memorize it. Men and women search for meaning. They search for hope, for fulfillment, yearn for faith in something beyond themselves, and cry desperately for love and community to support them. Let me just read it again real quickly. Men and women search for meaning, hope for fulfillment, yearn for faith in something beyond themselves, and cry desperately for love and community to support them. As we approach the official celebration of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, let us hear his words again. Let us try to heed his words. Let us try to heed his call that for us to create the kind of shared lives that we aspire to have, that we will need to break down the walls of hostility that exist between and among us, the walls of hostility that separate us from one another, the walls of hostility that keep us apart from one another. And so I hope as you move towards King's birthday and then the days after, that you'll think about this, about how do we tear down the walls that are between us? How do we come together to create shared lives? And how do we come together to make community a common enterprise? I hope as you move forward from today, you'll share your thoughts with me. You'll send me your comments. You'll tell me about your experiences. And I know I can tell you that I'll be coming back to these issues, these themes time and again over the course of 2019. And so thanks for joining us on another episode of Harwood Half Hour. As you know, we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. It's a great time. Our work is rooted in the philosophy of civic faith and the practice of turning outward. Our approach has spread to all 50 states in the US and has been pulled into 40 countries worldwide. And on this 30th anniversary, we have recommitted ourselves to finding ways to support you in your efforts in your communities to create shared lives with others and to shape your future destiny together. Thanks so much for joining me. Look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks from today at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll send out a notice. See you then. Thanks so much.